The village of Uhuakpa was a place of peace, where the people lived by the rhythms of nature. By day, farmers tilled the land, while children played beneath the shade of the great udara trees. But when night fell, an eerie sound filled the air, a sorrowful wailing that sent shivers through every spine. No one knew where it came from, yet the cries were enough to unsettle even the bravest warriors. The elders spoke of angry spirits. Mothers clutched their children closer, and men whispered about unseen forces roaming the land. At first, the people ignored it, hoping the cries would stop. But as days turned to weeks, tragedy struck. Infants, no older than 4 years, began to fall ill and die without explanation. The medicine men tried herbs and sacrifices, yet nothing worked. It was as if an unseen force was draining the very essence of life from the village's youngest. The fear grew into desperation, and whispers of curses and dark magic spread. In hushed voices, they wondered, who among them had angered the gods? Who had called down this unseen horror upon their land? One night, as the wailing echoed through the village, a woman named Neka, mother of a 6-month-old baby, lay awake. Unlike the others, she refused to cower in fear. Instead, she listened intently, following the sound with her ears, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something familiar about the cry. It wasn't coming from the spirits, it was coming from within the village itself. Neka tightened her grip on her child. She knew then that she had to find the source of the wailing before it was too late. Neka lay still, her ears straining to separate the wailing from the rustling of leaves outside. The eerie cries drifted through the air, seeming to come from all directions at once. She tightened her arms around her baby, Ifunanya, who whimpered softly in her sleep. Fear coiled in her stomach, but a determination stronger than her terror took root. She had lost 2 children before, both taken in the dead of night by an unknown illness. She would not let her last child suffer the same fate. Summoning her courage, she rose from her mat and tiptoed toward the window. The moon cast a silver glow over the village, bathing the clay huts and narrow footpaths in pale light. Her gaze swept across the compound, searching for anything unusual. Then, she saw it, a shadow moving near the hut of her neighbor, Mama Ejima. It was small, almost childlike, but its movements were unnatural, too fluid, too silent. The shadow paused by the door, and Neka's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to warn the household. But the moment she moved, the figure vanished into the darkness. Her heart pounded violently as she turned back to her sleeping child. Was this the spirit that had been haunting Uhuakpa? If it was, then it wasn't just a wandering ghost, it had a purpose. And that purpose was tied to the dying children. She needed proof. If the elders were to believe her, she had to catch it in the act. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped her sleeping baby tighter and sat awake, waiting for the figure to return. Little did she know, the answer to the village's suffering was far closer than she imagined. Neka forced herself to stay awake, her body stiff with tension. The wailing had stopped, but her heart still pounded with unease. The shadow she had seen, was it real? Or had her fears conjured it from the depths of her imagination? She listened closely to the night, every rustle of leaves and distant hoot of an owl amplifying her anxiety. Her grip on Ifunanya tightened, as if holding her child closer would shield her from the unseen terror lurking in the village. Just as she began to drift into uneasy sleep, a faint creak from the doorway jolted her awake. The fire in her hut had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Then she saw it, movement in the corner of the room. A figure, small and frail-looking, crouched near the sleeping mat. At first, Neka thought it was a child. But as the figure turned toward her, the dim light caught its eyes, hollow, lifeless, yet glowing with an eerie yellow hue. Terror paralyzed her, but only for a moment. Acting on instinct, she let out a piercing scream and lunged forward. The intruder flinched, hissing like a startled cat before darting toward the doorway. But Necker had seen enough. The figure was not a wandering spirit. It was a person, a girl. Her maid. Omalicha. The realization struck Necker like lightning. Omalicha, the young maid she had taken in as an orphan. The girl she had fed, clothed, and treated as her own. She was the one behind the wailing. She was the reason the children were dying. Horror and betrayal clashed in Necker's heart as the girl disappeared into the night. But Necker would not let this go unanswered. She would expose Omalicha for what she truly was. Necker's scream had shattered the quiet of the night, sending her husband, Obina, rushing into the hut with a machete in hand. "What happened?" he demanded, his eyes darting around wildly. Still shaken, Necker clutched Ifunanya to her chest. "It was Omalicha," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She was here. She was trying to take our child." Obina's face darkened with disbelief. "Omalicha? The maid?" "Yes. I saw her with my own eyes," Necker insisted. "She moved like a shadow, her eyes. Obina, they were not normal. They glowed in the dark." Obina hesitated, then stormed outside. "Omalicha!" he bellowed into the night. "Come out at once." But the only response was the rustling of palm fronds and the distant chirp of crickets. By now, other villagers had begun emerging from their huts, drawn by the commotion. Lanterns flickered as concerned faces peered out from doorways. Mama Ejima, holding her twin boys close, approached with wary eyes. "Necker, what is happening?" Necker took a deep breath, knowing the weight of what she was about to say. "The wailing that has haunted our village. The deaths of our children. I believe Omalicha is behind it." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. Mama Ejima clutched her sons tighter. "That girl? But she's just a child." "A child who moves like a spirit," Necker shot back. "A child who disappears into the night and leaves only sorrow behind." The elders, awakened by the noise, arrived, their stern faces illuminated by the soft glow of torches. "Where is the girl now?" Elder Ava asked gravely. "She ran," Obina answered, his voice edged with frustration. "But she cannot have gone far." The village erupted into murmurs. Some still doubted, but others, especially those who had lost children, were beginning to see the truth. The villagers stood in uneasy silence, their faces flickering with doubt, fear, and disbelief under the dim torchlight. Some murmured among themselves, stealing glances at Necker as if unsure whether to believe her claims. Others, especially the grieving mothers, clenched their fists in anguish, their sorrow threatening to turn into rage. Elder Ava, the eldest among them, cleared his throat. His voice, though frail with age, carried the weight of wisdom. "These are grave accusations, Necker," he said. "Omalicha has lived among us for years. She has served in many homes. Why would she suddenly turn to evil?" Necker shook her head. "I don't know, but I swear on my ancestors, I saw her. She was not like a normal child. Her eyes, they glowed in the dark. She moved like a shadow. If I hadn't screamed, she would have taken my child's soul." A heavy silence followed. The villagers had long searched for answers to the mysterious wailing and sudden deaths of children. Yet none had suspected Omalicha. Mama Ejima stepped forward, her face pale. "I lost my youngest son, Chukwuma, 3 nights ago," she whispered. He was healthy when I put him to sleep, but by morning, he was gone. His body was cold, as if something had drained the life from him. Others began to nod. My niece died the same way, a man added. No fever, no sign of sickness, just lifeless by dawn. The murmurs grew louder. Some villagers clutched charms around their necks, whispering prayers for protection. The suspicion that had been a mere ember now burned into full-blown fear. But if she is truly behind this, the younger man asked, his voice shaking, then what is she? The question sent a shiver through the crowd. A child, elder of a muttered. Or something that only looks like one. The realization hit them all at once. Omalicha was not like them. She was something else. And she was still out there, hiding in the darkness. Omalicha crouched behind a cluster of thick banana trees. Her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The villagers' torches flickered in the distance, their voices sharp with fear and suspicion. She had been careless, too confident in her abilities. She had never been caught before. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, listening. The night had always been her ally, cloaking her movements, making her one with the darkness. But now, the night felt different. It no longer welcomed her as it once had. She closed her eyes and tried to steady herself. The hunger still burned inside her, a deep, insatiable craving that no human food could satisfy. The baby's soul had been within reach. She had felt it, warm and pulsing, ready to be drawn into her grasp. But Neka had stopped her. Neka. Omalicha had underestimated the woman's instincts. She had been so close, but now the entire village was hunting her. The whispers in the wind carried her name like a curse. They know. A shudder ran through her. The others, the ones who had created her, who had given her this power, had warned her that humans must never find out. That once the truth was known, she would be vulnerable. She had to leave. But where would she go? Uhuapa had been her home for years. She had lived among them, eaten their food, fetched water from the same stream. Yet she was not one of them. She never had been. Omalicha peeked out from her hiding place, her glowing eyes dimming as she willed herself to remain unseen. The villagers were gathering near the elder's hut now, their voices rising in debate. They would soon decide her fate. She had to act before they found her. She had to survive. The villagers gathered in the central square, their faces tense with fear and uncertainty. The flames from the torches cast flickering shadows on the elder's hut, where the village's most respected men and women sat in solemn contemplation. Elder Ava, the wisest among them, tapped his staff against the ground, calling for silence. This is not a matter we can take lightly, he began, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. We have all heard Neka's testimony. We have all suffered the loss of our children. But we must ask ourselves, who, or what, is Omalicha? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. She is an Ogbanj. Mama Ejima burst out, gripping her wrapper tightly. She moves like the wind, and the children die without cause. What more proof do we need? A chorus of agreement followed. The villagers had always whispered about Ogbanj, children, born with the spirits of the restless dead, cursed to die young and return again and again to torment their families. But Omalicha had not died and been reborn. She had remained, growing among them like any other child. Could an Ogbanj truly live this long? Elder Ava stroked his graying beard thoughtfully. If she is an Ogbanj, then we must consult the Dibia. He alone can tell us what must be done. Obina nodded firmly. Then let us go to him at once. If we delay, she may escape. But Elder Ephema, the oldest woman in the village, raised a hand, silencing them. Her eyes, clouded with years of wisdom, swept across the crowd. Omalicha is no ordinary child, she said slowly. And if she is not just an Ogbanj, then we must be prepared for something far worse. A chill ran through the villagers. The Dibia would have the answers. And when they found Omalicha, they would know exactly what to do with her. A group of men, led by Elder Ava and Obina, made their way through the dark forest toward the home of Dibia Ojukwu, the village's most powerful spiritual healer. The torches they carried barely cut through the thick mist curling around the trees, and the cries of distant night creatures sent shivers down their spines. The journey to the Dibia's shrine was never easy, perhaps by design. For only those truly in need sought his wisdom. When they arrived, the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen force. The shrine was an ancient structure, its walls made of red earth and marked with symbols long forgotten by most. A low fire crackled in the center, illuminating the figure of the old Dibia. He sat cross-legged on a mat, his eyes closed, as if he had been expecting them. Without opening his eyes, he spoke. "You come with questions about the child." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Elder Ava stepped forward. "Great One, we seek your wisdom. The girl Omalicha, our people believe she is an Ogbanj. But she does not die and return. Instead, she steals the souls of our children." Dibia Ojukwu opened his eyes slowly, their depths like the dark river that separated the world of the living from the dead. "She is not an Ogbanj," he said at last, his voice grave. "She is something far older. Something more dangerous." The air in the shrine grew colder. Obina felt the hairs on his arms rise. "Then what is she?" he asked hesitantly. The Dibia reached for a bowl of white chalk and traced a strange symbol on the ground. "She is Muondu, a spirit of stolen life. She was not born as you were. She was created, shaped by forces that feed on the breath of children." He paused, his gaze darkening. "She has taken many souls, but she has never been fully human. Not yet." Elder Ephema's warning echoed in Obina's mind. "Something far worse." Elder Ava swallowed hard. "Then how do we stop her?" The Dibia stared into the fire, his face unreadable. "To strip her of what she is. She must be bound in the sacred earth and cleansed with the blood of the living. Only then will she see the world as humans do. Only then will she feel the weight of the lives she has taken." A heavy silence followed his words. They had come for answers. But what they had found was far more terrifying than they had imagined. The villagers returned from the Dibia's shrine in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on them like an unseen force. Omalicha was not just an Ogbanj. She was something far worse, a Muondu, a spirit created from stolen lives. And if they did not act quickly, she would continue to take their children. By the time Elder Ava and the others arrived in the village square, the crowd had grown. News of their visit to the Dibia had spread, and fear had settled into every face. Mothers clutched their children close, while the men tightened their grips on machetes and hunting spears. Elder Ava stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. "The Dibia has spoken," he announced. "Omalicha is no ordinary child. She is a Muondu, a spirit that feeds on the life of the innocent. We must act before she takes another soul." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Mama Ejima wiped her eyes. "Then what must we do?" Obina took a deep breath. "The Dibia has given us a way to strip her of her powers, to make her see the world as we do. But it will not be easy. We must perform a ritual, to bind her to the sacred earth and cleanse her with the blood of the living." Gasps of shock followed his words. "Whose blood?" a woman whispered. "The blood of one who still breathes," Elder Ephema said, stepping forward. A sacrifice, but not of death, of pain. The blood must come from one who willingly gives it. One whose spirit is strong enough to withstand the burden of cleansing her. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. Then, Neka took a step forward. "I will do it," she said firmly. "She tried to take my daughter's soul. If my blood will cleanse her, then I will give it." Obina clenched his fists, torn between pride and fear for his wife. But there was no time to argue. The decision had been made. Elder Ava nodded gravely. "Then we must act before dawn." The villagers hurried into motion. Some began digging the sacred pit at the edge of the village, where the ritual would take place. Others gathered the necessary herbs, clay, and charms. The hunters prepared ropes woven with sacred palm fronds, the only thing strong enough to bind a spirit. The night was thick with tension. Every shadow seemed to hold Omalicha's presence. Every whisper carried the fear of what was to come. Somewhere in the darkness, the girl they once knew was watching. And she knew they were coming for her. Omalicha sat perched on a low branch of the ancient Iroko tree, her glowing eyes fixed on the village below. The air was different tonight, charged with a tension she had never felt before. The usual rhythm of life in Uhuakpa had been replaced with frantic movement. The villagers were not sleeping. They were preparing. She watched as they dug a pit near the sacred grove, their faces tight with determination. The hunters wove ropes with palm fronds, their hands moving quickly, their expressions grim. Neka, the woman who had nearly caught her, sat by the fire, speaking with the elders. Blood would be spilled tonight. She could smell it in the air. A cold realization settled over her. They knew what she was. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. For years, she had lived among them, unseen for what she truly was. They had called her child, given her food, let her fetch water alongside their daughters. But she was not one of them. She never had been. A low growl built in her throat, but she swallowed it back. Rage would not save her. Fear would not, either. She needed to think. The Dibia. They must have gone to him. He was the only one who could see beyond the veil, who could name things that did not belong in this world. If he had told them what she was, then they would stop at nothing to take her power. Her fingers dug into the tree bark. She had stolen many souls before, slipping through the darkness like a shadow, unseen, untouchable. But now, for the first time, she was being hunted. She needed to run. But where? The ones who had made her would not welcome her back now that she had been exposed. The village beyond Uhuakpa would kill her on sight if they knew what she had done. And if the villagers caught her before she escaped. Her stomach twisted. She had seen what they did to spirits who broke the natural order. The sacred earth. The blood ritual. If they bound her to the land, she would lose everything. She would become human. The thought was more terrifying than death itself. No. She would not let them take her. With one last glance at the village, Omalicha leaped from the tree, her feet landing silently on the forest floor. The night still held some power for her. If she moved quickly, she could disappear into the depths of the wilderness before dawn. The hunters would search for her, but they would not find her. Not before she found a way to strike first. Omalicha's feet barely touched the ground as she moved through the thick forest. The canopy above her a dark, protective shield. She had always known the woods better than anyone, its winding paths, hidden clearings, and secret passages were familiar to her. Tonight, the forest seemed to whisper her name, urging her to flee further into its depths. But no matter how far she ran, she knew the villagers would not stop hunting her. The adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing her faster and faster. Her heart hammered against her chest, its rhythm in sync with the urgency of her flight. She couldn't let them bind her to the earth. The blood ritual, the thought of becoming human, of losing her powers, made her stomach churn. She had been created for a reason. To walk between worlds, to take what did not belong. To become a mere mortal would be a fate worse than death. The path ahead was tangled with vines and sharp roots, but she moved with grace, unbothered by the obstacles that would have tripped a normal human. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, guiding her like twin lanterns. But even with her speed, she could sense that they were closing in on her. The villagers knew the forest well, too. They had trackers, men who could follow the smallest signs, the faintest disturbance in the earth. She had to throw them off. Omalicha veered sharply off the main trail, heading toward the river. The water could mask her scent. The villagers would expect her to run deeper into the woods, to the hills where the spirits were said to dwell. But she knew the river would be her salvation, at least for tonight. As she reached the bank, the cold air from the water hit her face. But she didn't pause. She took a deep breath, then dipped her fingers into the river and muttered a quick incantation under her breath. The water rippled and shimmered as a strange energy began to form around her, cloaking her presence. The spell was not perfect. It could not make her invisible, but it would slow the villagers' pursuit, if only for a short while. Omalicha glanced behind her, her glowing eyes catching the faintest movement through the trees. They were coming. She could hear their voices, the sound of their torches crackling in the distance. A sharp pang of fear coursed through her, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving. The river curved sharply ahead, leading into the forest's dense heart. She knew the direction she was heading. It would lead her to an old shrine, one that had been abandoned long ago. The shrine had been built by the original elders to honor the spirits, but it had fallen into disuse as the village grew. It was a place forgotten by time, a place where the earth held memories of the ancient past. Omalicha could feel the power of the shrine calling to her. Perhaps, if she reached it, she could call upon the spirits of old, find a way to undo what the villagers had planned for her. The path was difficult, overgrown with thorns and twisted branches. But she pushed through, her mind fixed on the shrine ahead. She could not let the villagers win. She would not let them strip her of what she was. As the forest grew darker and the sounds of the village faded behind her, Omalicha's determination solidified. She would find a way to turn the tables. The villagers would regret ever seeking the Dibia's help. But for now, the chase was on. Omalicha's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she pushed through the thick underbrush, her feet slipping over wet stones and uneven roots. The cold night air pressed against her skin, and her heartbeat thundered in her ears, almost drowning out the sounds of the world around her. Yet, despite the frantic pace of her escape, a quiet certainty had begun to settle in her chest. She was close. The shrine was near. She could feel it, the ancient energy in the air. The earth itself seemed to hum with power, as though the place had been waiting for her. The trees, towering and gnarled, leaned in toward her like silent guardians, their twisted limbs forming a canopy above that allowed only the faintest slivers of moonlight to break through. Finally, she broke through the last line of trees and into a small clearing. There it stood, the shrine. It was nothing like the vibrant, sacred spaces the villagers built for the spirits. This one had been forgotten by time, its stone altar covered in moss and vines. The air felt heavy here, laden with memories of long-lost rituals and power that had once been revered. The shrine was built upon an ancient circle of stones, each one etched with symbols that no one in the village had spoken of for generations. They were markings of a time long before the village's creation. Signs of an older, more dangerous magic, one that could bind a spirit, and perhaps even release it. Omalicha stepped into the circle, the energy immediately reacting to her presence. It pulsed around her like a living thing, swirling through the air, rushing over her skin. She could feel the power of the shrine calling her, inviting her to tap into it, to claim it as her own. For a moment, she hesitated. Her heart fluttered nervously. The spirits of this place were not like the ones in the village, kind, forgiving. No, these spirits were older, more unpredictable. They had seen the rise and fall of countless generations, and their power was bound by laws that only those of her kind could understand. But desperation flooded her veins. She couldn't let them take her. Omalicha knelt before the altar, her fingers brushing over the ancient stone. She muttered an incantation, a language long forgotten, one passed down to her by those who had created her. The words felt like they had always belonged to her, part of her very being. The air thickened, swirling with energy. The stones around her began to glow faintly, their symbols lighting up as if responding to her plea. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink deeper into the magic, feeling the pull of the spirits who lingered in this place. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The wind began to rise, howling around the clearing, its force growing with every passing second. The shrine trembled, its ancient stones vibrating as if awakened from a long slumber. In the distance, Omalicha could hear the faint sound of drums, the call of a ritual being prepared, a warning from the spirits, or perhaps a beckoning. But as the wind grew louder, she felt a presence. It was not the welcoming energy she had hoped for, but something far darker, something more ancient, pushing back against her. The ground beneath her began to crack, a deep rumbling reverberating through the earth. Omalicha's heart raced. She had known this could happen. The shrine's power was not easily bent to the will of a spirit like her. It could bind her as easily as it could empower her. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a pulse of energy to shield herself. The force collided with the barrier of magic that the shrine had summoned, and the air exploded with a deafening crack. She gasped as the energy surged through her body, pain jolting through her limbs. Her skin burned, but she held on, refusing to back down. The spirits of the shrine would not give up without a fight. But Omalicha would not lose. She was the Muondu, being forged of darkness, and she had been born to fight. This place may have held power, but she would claim it. She was not ready to give up everything she was, not yet. The village had fallen silent, save for the whispers of anxious voices that buzzed like insects around the fire. The villagers were on edge, and the air felt dense with anticipation as they gathered their tools and prepared for the final stage of their ritual. Word had spread quickly, Omalicha was no longer among them, but they knew where she was heading. The elders had made it clear, the forest would be her final battleground, and they would not let her slip through their fingers. Neka stood at the head of the group, her brow furrowed with worry. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest like an iron bar. The decision to confront Omalicha in the forest had not come lightly, but the village's suffering could no longer be ignored. Every night, the wailing continued, a mourning sound that chilled the heart of anyone who heard it. The children, those sweet, innocent children, were dying, taken in their sleep. And it was Omalicha who had been the cause of it all. As the group ventured deeper into the forest, the path grew darker, the dense trees swallowing the moonlight. The air felt heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The drums in the distance, the unmistakable rhythm of the ritual grew louder, echoing off the trees. Omalicha was near. "Stay close," Neka whispered to the group. Her voice, usually steady and strong, trembled in the stillness of the night. The air was thick with magic, and she could feel it pressing against her skin like an unseen weight. There was no turning back now. The Dibia had prepared the necessary charms. Potions that would weaken Omalicha's connection to the spirit world, and sacred herbs to protect them from the dark magic that she wielded. But even with all the precautions, Neka knew that Omalicha was dangerous. The young maid had always been silent, polite, even sweet at times. But the secrets she harbored were far darker than anything they had ever imagined. The closer they drew to the clearing, the more the village's hunters could feel a shift in the air. A strange pressure that seemed to grow heavier with each step. They exchanged wary glances, their hands tightening around their spears. The hairs on the back of Neka's neck stood on end, and she instinctively reached for the charm the Dibia had given her. It was a small, smooth stone that vibrated with power. Its purpose was to protect her from Omalicha's ability to twist the very fabric of their reality. "Prepare yourselves," Neka called out. "We're almost there." They crossed into the clearing with an unsettling quietness, the torches in their hands casting long shadows across the ground. And there, at the center of the shrine, stood Omalicha. She was kneeling in front of the ancient altar, her body silhouetted against the glowing stones that marked the shrine's boundary. Her head was bowed, her arms spread wide as though she were summoning something, someone. For a moment, everything stood still. The group of villagers held their breath, watching the scene unfold before them. But then, with a sharp hiss, the air seemed to crackle with energy. It was as if the very earth was alive. The power of the shrine surging through the air, flowing into Omalicha. The village's magic, the one they had trusted to bind her, was being repelled by her own dark force. She was not weak. "Stop!" Neka shouted, her voice breaking through the tension in the air. Omalicha's head snapped up, and her glowing eyes locked onto Neka. There was no recognition in her gaze, only coldness, a creature far removed from humanity. "You should have stayed away," Omalicha whispered, her voice smooth, but carrying a chilling promise. The ground beneath her feet began to rumble, and the stones around the shrine began to glow brighter. The symbols etched into them, shifting and twisting in ways that defied nature. Before Neka could react, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The trees groaned as their roots twisted upward, the air thick with a strange wind that carried an ancient whisper. It was a warning, a final warning to the villagers who had come to destroy her. "We have come to end this," Neka said, holding her ground. She clutched the charm tighter, and the villagers formed a protective circle around her, their weapons raised. Omalicha's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You cannot stop what is already in motion." As the wind picked up, swirling around her, Neka knew the battle had begun. There would be no turning back. The villagers had to act quickly, for if they hesitated, they too would become a part of the ancient force that was now awakening in the forest. The winds howled through the forest, a growing storm of energy swirling around Omalicha. As the villagers stood frozen in the clearing, the ancient stones of the shrine pulsed with an eerie glow, their symbols shifting as though alive. The magic that had lain dormant for centuries now stirred, and the very air seemed to hum with anticipation. But the villagers, still reeling from the discovery of Omalicha's power, had no idea what they were truly standing on, the source of all their suffering. Neka's gaze was drawn to the altar, the center of the shrine, where Omalicha had knelt. Beneath her, the stones beneath the altar shimmered, not with any ordinary light, but with an unnatural, swirling energy. The symbols, though worn and faint, had not only been etched by the hands of their ancestors, they were the marks of an ancient order. A long-forgotten sect of sorcerers whose magic was as old as the land itself. They had bound the spirits to the earth, weaving threads of life and death, giving birth to creations far darker than any of the villagers could comprehend. As the wind whipped through the trees, the symbols on the stones grew more distinct, glowing brighter and shifting in shape. Neca stepped forward, drawn by an unknown pull toward the center of the circle, where the earth seemed to quiver with life. The moment her foot touched the ground inside the shrine, a powerful jolt of energy shot up her spine, and she staggered, barely able to hold her balance. This place, this shrine, Neca whispered under her breath, a sense of dread creeping over her. She had heard old stories, the kinds of tales whispered around fire circles in hushed voices, the ones that spoke of the first sorcerers who had used this power for their own dark purposes, and of those who had fallen prey to its allure. The Dibia had warned them, but there was no understanding of just how deep the magic ran. Omalicha had been drawn to the shrine not just for its power, but because she knew it could sustain her, reshape her. It was a place where spirits could be both captured and freed, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. The moment Omalicha had spoken her incantation, she had tapped into something far beyond her reach, a pact made long ago, one forged in the bones of the earth itself. But as Omalicha fought to harness the energy, the shrine's true nature revealed itself. The stones beneath the altar began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The air shimmered with an unnatural glow, and the wind that had swept through the forest now screamed with an otherworldly force. The power that had once been contained was now being unleashed, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. The ground trembled, and from the depths of the earth, ancient spirits began to rise. Faces appeared in the mist, ghastly, hollow-eyed figures that floated above the ground, their hollow voices drifting through the night air. They were the first beings to walk the earth, trapped in the limbo between life and death, never able to leave the shrine's boundaries. These spirits had been waiting for a vessel, someone to release them from their prison. "Omalicha, stop!" Neca cried out, her voice strained, but it was too late. The spirits surged, enveloping the clearing in a thick fog, and the ground beneath her feet began to crack, as if the earth itself was splitting open. The villagers backed away, their weapons trembling in their hands. What they had thought was just a young maid's dark secret had become something far more terrifying, something no one could control. Omalicha, now standing with her arms raised high, was lost in the power that swirled around her. Her eyes were glazed over, no longer the familiar brown they had once been, but now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. She had become something else entirely, neither fully human nor entirely spirit, caught in a space between worlds. The spirits around her wailed, their voices a cacophony of sorrow and rage. They had been imprisoned for centuries, and now, they sought vengeance. Omalicha, though trembling with the weight of the energy she had drawn, was no longer a victim. She had become the conduit, the key to unlocking their freedom. She could feel them inside her, twisting and writhing, clawing at her consciousness. Neca's heart raced as she stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Omalicha, please." The village. But the maid's lips parted, and the words that came out were not hers. They were the voices of the spirits, speaking through her in a language long forgotten. "The village will burn, the children will fall, and you will join us." The words echoed through the clearing, and the villagers, too, heard them. The promise of doom. With a final, blood-curdling scream, Omalicha threw herself to the ground. The stones beneath her lit up. The earth trembled violently, and a shockwave of energy exploded outward. The villagers were thrown back by the force, the air crackling with wild energy. For a moment everything went silent, the world holding its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had all started, the energy seemed to collapse in on itself. The spirits disappeared, their wails fading into nothingness. Omalicha lay motionless on the ground. Her body pale and trembling, her eyes no longer glowing. The shrine's power had been sealed once more, but at what cost? The villagers, bruised and stunned, stood in the aftermath. Omalicha was still alive, but something about her had changed. Her connection to the spirits had been severed. But she now bore the weight of what she had unleashed. Neka took a cautious step forward, her hand trembling as she reached down to touch the maid's shoulder. It was as though a veil had been lifted from her eyes. Omalicha, the young maid who had stolen their children's souls, was now a lost girl, trapped between two worlds. The villagers had won the battle. But the shrine's magic was a lingering force. A reminder that the past could never truly be erased. The clearing remained still, the oppressive silence settling over the villagers like a heavy cloak. The once violent storm of energy had dissipated, leaving only the faintest remnants of magic hanging in the air. Omalicha lay motionless on the ground, her body pale and weak, no longer consumed by the spirits she had once controlled. The villagers, still stunned from the violent display, took hesitant steps toward her, as though unsure whether to approach or retreat. Neka was the first to reach Omalicha, kneeling beside her. She placed a tentative hand on the maid's shoulder, relieved to find her breathing. But it was shallow and weak. There was no longer a fire in her eyes, no glowing light that had once marked her as something other than human. Omalicha was just a girl now, a girl who had lived with a power far beyond her comprehension. The villagers stood in a circle around them, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, confusion, and sorrow. What had they just witnessed? Was this the same Omalicha who had once cleaned their homes, carried their water, and cared for their children? The girl they had trusted, the girl they had welcomed into their lives, had been hiding a darkness so deep that it had consumed her entirely. "You've seen it too," Neka whispered to the others, her voice filled with disbelief. The spirits, they were real, and they were using her. One of the elders, Omalicha, stepped forward, her expression grave. She was just a vessel, Neka. She was young and vulnerable, but she did not know what she was invoking. The spirits preyed upon her, manipulated her, until she became their instrument of destruction. The words hung in the air, and the villagers were left grappling with the truth. The pain of their lost children, the wailing that had echoed through the village night after night, had all been a result of an ancient magic, one they had never fully understood. The shrine had been a forgotten place of power, and Omalicha had unknowingly awakened it. But even as the truth settled in, there was a deeper question that lingered in the hearts of the villagers. What would happen to Omalicha now? The Dibia had spoken of cleansing rituals, of stripping away the magic that had once claimed her. It was the only way to sever her connection to the spirits and free her from the curse that had bound her. But there was no guarantee that it would be enough. No one knew if Omalicha would ever truly be free of the forces that had once possessed her. "We need to return her to the village," Omalicha said, her voice stern yet compassionate. "We will perform the final rites. The magic must be undone, but she must also face the consequences of what she has done." Neka nodded, her heart heavy with sorrow. The villagers had suffered greatly, and they had lost so much. But Omalicha was no longer the monster they had once thought her to be. She was a girl, just a girl, who had been consumed by something far larger than herself. As the villagers lifted Omalicha and began the journey back to the village, the weight of the night's events pressed down on them. They had witnessed the power of the shrine, and they had seen the destruction it could bring. But they had also seen Omalicha's humanity. The fragility that lay beneath the darkness she had become. The village would heal, but it would never forget. The wailing would stop, but the scars it left would remain for years to come. And Omalicha, once the vessel of destruction, would now have to find a way to live as one of them. Stripped of the power that had shaped her. But even as they carried her back, Neca couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end of the story. The shrine was still there, its power still lingering beneath the earth. And somewhere, deep within, the spirits that had been freed might yet return. The journey back to the village was long and solemn. The villagers walked in silence, each step heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. Omalicha's body lay limp in their arms. Her face pale, her once strong spirit now broken. The wailing had stopped, but the village was far from peaceful. The nights would no longer echo with the cries of the lost children. But the scars left on the community would remain for generations. When they reached the village, the air seemed thicker, charged with the lingering presence of the dark magic that had once gripped Omalicha. The houses, once full of life, now felt like hollow shells. The elders gathered at the center, their eyes solemn as they prepared for the final rites. Omalicha would be cleansed. But the decision of what to do with her after that was one that could not be taken lightly. Mama Ifema, the elder who had taken the lead in this journey, motioned for the villagers to form a circle around the center. A fire was built, the smoke swirling upward into the still night air, carrying with it the scent of herbs and ancient prayers. The ritual had begun. Neca stood beside Omalicha, her heart torn. She couldn't shake the image of the innocent girl she had once known, now stripped of the power that had consumed her. Could the village truly forgive her for what she had done? The Dibia, who had witnessed the ancient magic, stepped forward, holding a sacred staff in his hands. His deep voice echoed through the silence as he began to chant, invoking the spirits of the ancestors. The words were foreign, their meanings lost to most of the villagers. But they were a part of the cleansing process, an attempt to strip away the remnants of the dark magic that had once bound Omalicha. As the ritual continued, Omalicha's body twitched. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes flickered open, but the once glowing light was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Omalicha was truly human again. Is she free? Neca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Dibia nodded, his face etched with both sadness and wisdom. The magic is no longer hers. She has been severed from the spirits. But the damage done cannot be undone so easily. The villagers were silent, their gazes fixed on Omalicha. She sat there, dazed and confused, her mind struggling to process the immense power that had once been a part of her. The cleansing had worked, she was no longer the monster they had feared, but what now? The elders convened in quiet conversation, their voices low. Some wanted to cast Omalicha out entirely, to send her away from the village to live out her days in isolation. Others felt pity for the girl, understanding that she had been nothing more than a pawn in the hands of the spirits. She had been manipulated, her humanity twisted by the forces she had invoked. After what seemed like hours, Mama Ifema stood before the gathered villagers. Her voice was firm, yet compassionate. Omalicha has paid for her actions. She has been cleansed of the magic that controlled her. But she cannot stay here. The villagers gasped, but Mama Ifema held up a hand. She will go back to her biological parents. She will be given a chance to start anew, to live as a human among humans. But she will no longer be a maid. Nor will she ever be allowed to wield any magic again. Neca felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. Omalicha had been born into a life that had taken away her innocence. A life that had made her a tool of something dark and powerful. Now, she would be forced to live with the consequences of her actions. Never able to return to the world she had once known. Omalicha, Neka said softly, kneeling beside her. Do you understand what has happened? Omalicha looked up at her, her eyes filled with confusion and sorrow. She nodded slowly, her voice hoarse. I never meant to hurt anyone. I didn't know what I was doing. The spirits. They controlled me. Neka gently touched her hand, offering what little comfort she could. You will find your way. You will live as a human now. But you must leave this place, Omalicha. Omalicha's lips trembled as she nodded. I will go. I will go back to my family. The villagers watched as Omalicha stood up, her legs weak. But her spirit no longer bound by the dark forces. She had been given a chance to live a life free of magic and manipulation. But that life would be full of hardship, full of the struggle to regain what she had lost. As the villagers watched Omalicha leave, the weight of the past settled over them like a heavy cloud. The children who had once been stolen from their homes could never return. And the village would bear the scars of those losses for generations to come. But the wailing had stopped, and with that, a fragile peace had begun to settle over the community. Omalicha walked away from the village. The sounds of the night wrapping around her like a blanket. She was no longer the girl who had stolen souls. Nor was she the monster who had terrorized them. She was just a girl, returning to the family she had long forgotten. To a life she would have to rebuild from the ground up. But deep in her heart, Omalicha knew that the spirits had not fully left her. They had been severed from her body, but their whispers would never fade entirely. And no matter where she went, they would follow her, watching, waiting for the moment she might be tempted to call them back. The journey back to her biological parents was long. The road winding through dense forests and sparse villages. Each stretch of land a reminder of the life Omalicha had once known, a life that seemed so distant now. The village behind her, with its echoes of wailing and dark magic, faded from view, but the weight of what she had done, of what she had been, followed her like an invisible shadow. Omalicha had no idea what awaited her when she reached her family's home. It had been years since she last saw them, and even then, she had been just a child, too young to understand the complexity of her family's struggles. She had been taken in by the village as an orphan, raised by those who had used her for their own gain. But now, as she walked alone toward her parents' home, she was returning as a stranger, a girl burdened with a past she couldn't erase. As she approached the familiar thatched roof of her family's hut, she saw her mother, Nina, standing outside. The older woman's eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. She hadn't expected Omalicha to return, not after all this time. Omalicha? Nina's voice was tentative, as if she were unsure whether she was seeing a ghost or her long-lost daughter. Omalicha's heart ached as she stood before her mother. She had dreamed of this moment countless times, returning home, being embraced with love, with the warmth of family. But now, she was a stranger to herself. And the girl standing before Nina was no longer the one who had left all those years ago. I've come home, mother, Omalicha whispered, her voice shaky. Tears welled up in Nina's eyes as she rushed forward, embracing her daughter. My child, you are home at last. She held Omalicha tightly, her tears wetting the girl's hair. I never gave up on you. I prayed every day that you would come back. But Omalicha's body remained stiff in her mother's arms. She couldn't bring herself to return the embrace the way she should have. Her thoughts were consumed by the memories of the power she had once wielded, the destruction, the souls she had taken. Even now, she could still hear their cries in her mind. She had been freed, yes. But the guilt of her actions was a heavy burden to carry. "Mother," Omalicha began, her voice trembling. "I'm not the same girl you remember. I've done terrible things. I don't know if I can ever make up for them." Nina pulled back, gazing at her daughter with confusion, but also a deep sadness. "What do you mean, my child? What has happened to you?" The story spilled out of Omalicha in broken fragments, the spirits, the curse, the wailing that had haunted the village, the magic she had once controlled. She told her mother everything. From the moment she had unknowingly begun her dark journey, to the night she had been cleansed by the villagers. She didn't hold back, revealing the full extent of the evil she had been a part of. Nina listened in stunned silence, her face pale with shock. She had always known that something had been wrong with her daughter, but she never could have imagined the truth. Her heart ached for the girl she had once known, and now, the girl before her seemed so far removed from the sweet child she had raised. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nina whispered, her voice thick with pain. "Why didn't you come home sooner?" "I didn't know how," Omalicha replied, her voice hollow. "I was lost, Mother. I was trapped by something I didn't understand. But now I'm free." Nina reached out, cupping Omalicha's face in her hands. "You are home now. And you will heal. Whatever you've done, we will face it together. You're my daughter, Omalicha. And I will not turn my back on you." But Omalicha couldn't feel the comfort she had once longed for. Her mother's words, though kind, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. She felt broken, disconnected, as though her soul had been torn apart and stitched back together with pieces that didn't quite fit. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Omalicha whispered, stepping back. "I can't go back to the way things were. I'm not the person I once was. I don't even know who I am anymore." Her mother's eyes filled with compassion. "You are still my daughter, Omalicha. You are still the girl I raised. And no matter what you've done, no matter what has happened to you, you will always have a place here. This is your home." But Omalicha was silent. She knew that while she might have found a physical home with her mother, she had lost something far more precious, her sense of self. How could she return to a life of normalcy when she had been a part of something so dark? How could she live with the knowledge that she had taken the lives of innocent children, even if unknowingly? Days passed, and Omalicha remained with her family, but she felt like an outsider. Her mother tried to comfort her, but the girl she had known was no longer the same. Omalicha spent her days wandering the forests, lost in her thoughts, haunted by the souls of the children she had stolen. At night, she would lie awake, the sound of their wailing still echoing in her mind, a constant reminder of what she had done. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Omalicha stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the village. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and earth. It was a peaceful scene, yet within her, there was a storm brewing, a storm of guilt, of longing, of uncertainty. She had been given a second chance, but could she truly start over? Could she ever find peace again? Or would the darkness always follow her, no matter where she went? As Omalicha turned to walk back to her family, she felt a shift deep within her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would have to learn to live with the consequences of her past. And in that painful truth, she might just find the path to redemption. Omalicha spent her nights in restless sleep, plagued by nightmares of the souls she had taken, faces of children, their eyes wide with terror as they were ripped from the world. The wailing that had once echoed through the village, now filled the quiet corners of her mind. A constant reminder of her dark past. No matter how much she tried to push it away, it lingered, gnawing at her soul. Her nights were filled with flashes of those innocent lives, snatched away by her own hands. She could no longer escape the truth of what she had done. The moment she closed her eyes, it was as though she could still feel the power surging through her. The dark magic that had once made her feel invincible. But now, that same power felt like a curse. It had torn her apart, shattered her into pieces she couldn't put back together. Each morning, she would wake with a hollow feeling in her chest. The weight of her actions pressing down on her like a stone. Her mother would bring her food, speak to her kindly, try to pull her from the depths of her own thoughts. But Omalicha couldn't escape the truth. She was a monster. The wailing of the children, their souls crying out for justice, would never leave her. Omalicha would sit by the river for hours, staring at her reflection in the water, hoping to see something, anything, that could reassure her she wasn't the girl she had been. The girl who had stolen lives. But the reflection that stared back at her was that of a stranger. Her features were the same, but her eyes, once full of youth and innocence, were now dull and haunted. She could see the darkness in them. The mark of someone who had crossed a line that could never be undone. Her mother, unaware of the depth of Omalicha's torment, tried to reassure her. "You're home now. You're safe. Let go of the past. You're not the person you were. You're my daughter, and that's all that matters." But Omalicha couldn't find solace in her mother's words. How could she be her daughter when the person she had become was unrecognizable? Every kind gesture, every comforting word, felt like a mockery. How could she accept love when she had been the source of so much pain? At night, when the village fell silent, Omalicha would walk through the forest, her footsteps soft on the earth. The trees, once a comforting presence, now seemed like silent sentinels, watching her every move. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. It felt as though the world around her had changed, as though it had turned its back on her. And perhaps it had. How could she expect the world to accept her when she couldn't even accept herself? The winds whispered to her in the night, and in those whispers, she could hear the voices of the children, their soft cries echoing in her ears. It was as if the forest itself had become her prison. She tried to ignore it, but the pain of their loss was inescapable. It wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. And there was no place where she could escape it. "Why?" she whispered into the night one evening, her voice breaking. "Why did I do it? How could I have been so blind?" The only answer she received was the rustling of the leaves, the soft sigh of the wind. The trees seemed to know the answer, but they wouldn't tell her. They wouldn't speak of the darkness that had consumed her, nor of the magic she had once wielded with reckless abandon. Omalicha knew she couldn't undo the past. She couldn't bring back the lives she had stolen. Nor could she erase the memories of the pain she had caused. The villagers might have cleansed her of her powers, but she still carried the weight of her actions with her, like an invisible chain. There was no magic to remove the guilt from her heart. No spell to make her feel whole again. Every day was a struggle to move forward, to live with the consequences of her choices. She could try to live a normal life with her mother, but the knowledge of her own darkness would always be there, lurking beneath the surface. The days began to blur together as Omalicha settled into her life with her biological parents. The village, once a place of mystery and fear, now seemed like a strange land, where the familiar faces of the villagers held no recognition for her. It was a place that neither accepted nor rejected her. But no matter how much she tried to blend in, she couldn't erase the cold emptiness that had taken root inside her. Her mother, Nina, would wake her early each day, insisting that she help with chores around the house, hoping to fill the gaps in her soul with hard work. At first, Omalicha complied without protest, her hands mechanically moving through the motions of sweeping the compound, fetching water, and grinding yam for dinner. She was a dutiful daughter, but every action felt distant, as if she were performing for an audience that no longer existed. Despite Nina's best efforts, Omalicha struggled with the concept of normalcy. The life she had lived in her former village, with its dark magic and sinister rituals, felt like a dream now. It was a part of her that she had been forced to bury, but it haunted her at every turn. Even in the simplest tasks, the darkness within her whispered its presence, an unsettling reminder of the power she had once wielded. Every evening, as the sun set and the village grew quiet, Omalicha would retreat to the edge of the forest, the place where she had once felt truly alive. She sat by the river, staring at her reflection in the still water, and wondered if this was what it meant to be human, to feel nothing but the weight of regret pressing down on you with every breath. Her mind often wandered to the village, to the people she had once known. What had become of them? Was she really the only one left who remembered the horrors? Could they ever forgive her? She felt the sharp sting of isolation, a loneliness that couldn't be filled by her mother's love or the comfort of the land around her. It was a deep-rooted sense of guilt and self-rejection that bound her to the past, keeping her from embracing the life she had now. One afternoon, as Omalicha was collecting firewood, she overheard a group of children playing by the edge of the village. They were laughing, their carefree voices carrying through the trees. Omalicha paused, her heart twisting in her chest. She had once been one of them, innocent, full of life, unaware of the darkness that would come to claim her. Now, she stood as a stranger, unable to connect with the very thing she had once been. She longed to be like them again, to laugh without fear, to feel the warmth of belonging. But she knew that part of her life was over. The world she had once inhabited was gone, and there was no going back. She was forever changed, forever marked by the choices she had made. Omalicha found herself longing for peace, for a sense of absolution that she knew she could never have. But the more she sought it, the more elusive it became. Her soul felt empty, like a vessel that could never be filled. She was trapped in her own regret, her own self-loathing. One night, as she sat by the river, gazing at the stars above, she wondered if she would ever find redemption. Could she ever forgive herself? Could she ever find a way to make amends for what she had done? She didn't know. And that uncertainty gnawed at her like a constant ache in her chest. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see her mother, Nina, walking toward her. Her face was filled with concern, but also a quiet strength. The kind of strength Omalicha had always admired in her. "Are you okay, Omalicha?" Nina asked softly, sitting beside her on the ground. Omalicha didn't answer immediately. She didn't know how to explain the turmoil within her, the war raging inside her heart. But she knew that her mother's presence brought her a sense of comfort, a fleeting reminder of what it felt like to be loved, to be accepted. "I don't know if I'll ever be okay, Mother," Omalicha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make things right." Nina placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. "One day at a time, my child. One day at a time." The past is behind you, and you're here now. That's all that matters. But Omalicha couldn't help but feel that the past would never be behind her. It was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being. And perhaps that was the greatest punishment of all, the knowledge that no matter how hard she tried, she would always carry the weight of what she had done. And so, Omalicha sat in silence, staring at the river, lost in the depths of her thoughts. The stars above shone brightly, as though offering a glimpse of hope. But all she could see was the darkness within herself. It was a darkness that would never truly fade. A part of her that would remain, forever bound to the past. Later that night, as she sat by the fire with her family, Omalicha felt a sharp pang of longing. The food that Nina prepared was warm and comforting. But the bitterness in her heart grew stronger with every bite. The love her mother offered seemed to come from a place of deep care. But Omalicha couldn't feel it as she once had. How could she accept love when she had given none in return? How could she be part of a family when she knew the dark monster she had been? The villagers, too, seemed to regard her with a certain distance. They greeted her with polite nods, but never lingered long enough to engage her in conversation. She felt their judgment hanging in the air, thick like a cloud of smoke. They had cast her out, forced her to live a life of normalcy, and in doing so, they had stripped her of the one thing she had craved the most, redemption. Now, she was a mere shadow of the person she had been, drifting through life without a sense of purpose or identity. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Omalicha wandered into the village square, feeling the weight of her thoughts pushing her further into isolation. The village elders sat around a fire, their faces glowing in the orange light. She hesitated, wondering if they would even acknowledge her presence. She had never been a part of their discussions before. But perhaps now they would see her as more than the girl who had once taken lives. Nina's voice broke through her thoughts. "Come, Omalicha," she said softly. "The elders are speaking. You should join us." With hesitation in her heart, Omalicha walked towards the fire, her feet dragging in the dust. As she sat down, she felt the weight of their gaze upon her, each of them silently acknowledging her presence but never daring to speak. She could see the judgment in their eyes, the unspoken knowledge of what she had done. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. As the night wore on, the elders discussed matters of the village, of crops and weather, of marriages and births. They spoke with a sense of authority, as though they held the answers to all of life's uncertainties. But to Omalicha, their words were hollow. She no longer cared about the affairs of the village. Her heart was too consumed with the struggle to find peace within herself. By the time the fire had burned low and the village had fallen into silence, Omalicha realized that she could no longer live in the shadow of her past. She could no longer pretend to be someone she was not. There would be no easy resolution, no magic to fix the pain she carried. The only way forward was to confront it, to accept the truth of who she had become, and learn to live with the consequences. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling, and turned toward her home. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as she walked away from the fire, she felt a faint glimmer of something, perhaps hope, perhaps acceptance. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself the thought that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live with the darkness and still have a place among the living. Omalicha's journey had reached its quiet, inevitable end. The struggle to reconcile the darkness inside her with the simplicity of the life she now led had been a constant battle. Each day was a fight against the memories of the souls she had taken, against the guilt that lingered in her chest, suffocating her. But that night, as the moon hung low in the sky and the village lay still, Omalicha made her final decision. As she walked toward her home, Her thoughts were clear for the first time in what felt like forever. The path before her was not one of escape, nor of trying to erase the past. It was a path of acceptance. She could no longer deny the monster she had been or the role she had played in the tragedy that had unfolded. The pain she had caused, both to the children whose souls she had stolen and to the village she had once belonged to, would never fully leave her. But she could no longer allow it to control her. When she reached her hut, Omalicha paused at the entrance. Nina, her mother, was seated inside, the soft light of the fire flickering across her face. She looked up when Omalicha stepped in, her eyes filled with quiet concern. For a moment, Omalicha stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of her mother, the woman who had taken her in despite the evil she had carried. The love in Nina's gaze felt like a distant echo, a love she could not yet fully accept. "I'm sorry, Mother," Omalicha whispered, her voice barely audible. Nina said nothing, but her eyes softened with understanding. She didn't need to hear the words. She had known all along that her daughter's journey would not be an easy one. Omalicha sat down beside her mother and placed her hands in her lap. The warmth of the fire, the steady beat of the night around them, was a comfort. But it wasn't the kind of comfort she had once known, a comfort that masked the darkness. This was different. It was a raw, quiet acceptance that came with acknowledging the truth. She would never be the innocent child she had been. She would never be able to undo the harm she had caused. But perhaps, in time, she could make amends. She could no longer hide behind the excuse that she was a victim of fate, of circumstance. No, she had been the one to choose. The one who had committed the acts that had led her here. And now, she had to find a way to live with that reality. "I want to try," she said, more to herself than to her mother. "I want to be better. I don't know how, but I will try." Nina nodded, placing a gentle hand on Omalicha's shoulder. There was no judgment in her touch. Only the kind of quiet strength that came from a love that had seen the worst of her daughter's soul and still chose to remain. And so, Omalicha began her new life, a life that was neither full of redemption nor forgiveness but one where she could finally begin to understand the human experience, pain, growth, and the possibility of healing. It would be a long road ahead, filled with more struggles and challenges. But she had taken the first step toward becoming someone who could, at last, see the world as it was meant to be seen. The villagers would never forget the wailing that had filled their nights. And neither would Omalicha. But in time, the sorrow would fade. And with it, the shadow that had once ruled her existence would grow smaller. For the first time in a long time, Omalicha felt a sliver of peace. She could not change the past, but she could shape her future. And that, in itself, was a gift.